and welcome to the Sangamon Experience. My name is Ann Mosley. I'm the Director and Curator for the Sangamon Experience at the University of Illinois at Springfield. This month, we're celebrating National Poetry Month. We are highlighting the local history that we have right in our backyard here in Sangamon County, celebrating the 200 years that our county has flourished and has produced a large number of citizens who have been able to communicate through their words, through lyrics, through music, and an assortment of many talents. Poetry Month tends to be a month where we highlight modern day poets, individuals who have the rhythm of words as well as the imagination to take in their surroundings and explore the wild prairie that we have here in central Illinois. We have had poets who have been around since the beginning of Sangamon County's history, but the most well-known here in the area is Vachel Lindsay. So we will be discussing the life and poetry of Vachel Lindsay, who lived here. And you can still see his house today, but I won't spoil it for you. I'm going to let our special guests here go into a little bit more detail about the great man. Now, as we have walked through the various topics pertaining to our local history in Sangamon County, we've covered trailblazing women, trailblazing African Americans, and we've been highlighting the origins of Sangamon County and how it has taken shape, and discovering those local stories that have kind of been hidden over the years, and discovering them once again and sharing them with all of you and the rest of the state of Illinois. So as we dive in tonight, I encourage you to take a closer listen and also pay close attention to the surroundings within the presentation, and take a deeper look into one of Springfield's own poets and what his life was like, how it influenced his poetry and writing, but also how his community affected the way he presented himself and how it changed him as a person. In addition to that, if you have any questions pertaining to Vachel Lindsay, his life, the historic site, but Springfield in general or Sangamon County, feel free to put those in the comments. We'd be more than happy to answer those at the very end of the program when we have our Q&A session. In addition to that, we are celebrating our Hometown Pride exhibit, which Vachel Lindsay plays a role in. He is the poet that we recognize the most with Sangamon County. There are many others out there. So if there is a specific poet that has influenced you that is from the Sangamon County area, feel free to send that in to the Sangamon Experience at sangamonexperience@uis.edu. Now, you've attended tonight to hear about Vachel Lindsay, so I won't continue my part of the conversation, but I do want to introduce our amazing guests. So tonight, we are honored to have two individuals from the Illinois Department of Natural Resources Office of Land Management. These two amazing interpreters have spent a lot of time researching not just Vachel Lindsay, but the historic sites that we have here in the central Illinois area as it pertains to Springfield. Now, our first guest is Jennifer Caldwell. She has always enjoyed sharing stories and making information accessible to diverse audiences. Throughout her career, she has provided learning and service opportunities for youth across a range of subjects, including science, outreach programs, which she also presented in New Zealand and throughout the sites here in Springfield, Illinois. In 2014, she was certified as an interpretive guide by the National Association for Interpretation and has helped develop interpretive programming for the state historic sites at Springfield and the Illinois Governor's Mansion. She has presented at the Conference on Illinois History and was named the Illinois Department of Natural Resources Historic Sites 2019 Employee of the Year. As she continues to work For the Illinois Department of Natural Resources Office of Land Management, she is continuing to touch the lives of students across our area, as well as visitors from all over the world. Our second guest is Sheila Ryan, and Sheila has been building on her core training and experience as an archivist. She has sought throughout her career to make history accessible to a wide audience. She has worked for institutions including the Wisconsin Historical Society, the Chicago History Museum, the Chicago Public Library, and Southern Illinois University, and has curated major exhibits, developing them for a range of programming initiatives, and has directed grant-funded outreach projects. She is currently a site interpreter with the Illinois Department of Natural Resources and continues to use her talents and skills to showcase the rich history from the Vachel Lindsay home, Dana Thomas House, and the Old State Capitol, and a few other sites that we have offered here in Central Illinois. As a former site interpreter, it is always so exciting to meet other interpreters in the field, because you learn something new every time. And so I hope you all are as excited as I am to learn about the Vachel Lindsay home and the poet who lived there. So I'm going to bring on Jennifer and Sheila. Hello, ladies. Now I'm going to turn it over to them and showcase the Vachel Lindsay presentation that you have provided for us. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to add them in the comments. We'll keep a lookout for them. And at the end, we'll have a Q&A session where we can ask you all of our burning questions about Vachel Lindsay.
All right, well, we want to welcome everybody here to the Vachel Lindsay home. We're actually in the home delivering the program to you tonight. So you get a little bit of a chance to see the site while you're learning about the subject as well. We're going to tell you a little bit about Vachel's life in general and some of the things that he did. And then Sheila and I have each picked one of his poems that is especially meaningful to us. And we're going to tell you the specific story behind that poem, where it came from, and what might have inspired him to write it. So you get a chance to kind of have an in-depth look at Vachel Lindsay's creative process, as well as learning a little bit about his life and some of his major accomplishments. But to start out with, we're going to give you a little bit of an introduction to who Vachel Lindsay is and how his life developed and what kind of started off his career. We're going to show you some of these slides here. Let's get this started. Here we go. So as you mentioned, my name is Jennifer, and Sheila is with me. We work for the Illinois Department of Land Management, or the Office of Land Management within the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. And the Vachel Lindsay Home State Historic Site is one of many historic sites across the state of Illinois that is managed by a DNR. So we're really excited to get to share this one with you tonight. Vachel Lindsay was born in this home that we're in right now, which is located at 603 South 5th Street in Springfield. And one of the things he said about his home was, everything begins and ends there for me. This was really his lifelong base from which he traveled the world. And he did become known not just here in Sangamon County or even across the United States, but in other areas of the world as well. So we'll get a chance to learn about all those aspects of his life. But everything sort of starts somewhere. So we're going to start with the beginning of Vachel's life. Vachel referred to himself as a rhymer designer. He said it was as he was drawing and designing that words came to him. And so he was born here in Springfield, like I said, in this house, November 10th, 1879. And that would have meant he was 13 years old when the Columbian Exposition arrived in Chicago in 1893. And Sheila's going to tell you a little bit more about that. He was here in Springfield during the time of the Springfield Race Riot in 1908. He was here in Springfield in August of 1914 as World War I begins in other areas of the world. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about the Panama Pacific Exposition and how his work played a role in that. But Vachel was the second born child and the only son of Dr. Vachel Thomas Lindsay and Catherine Frazee Lindsay. And that's their picture there on the bottom of the screen. And up above is Vachel and four of his five sisters, his older sister Olive, and then his younger sisters Isabel, Esther, and Eudora, all pictured there. But Vachel did have another younger sister named Joy. The Lindsay family suffered some tragedy early on during a scarlet fever epidemic in the 1880s. Three of the Lindsay girls, Isabel, Esther, and Eudora, unfortunately all passed away from scarlet fever. And then a year later, their sixth child, Joy, was born. And Vachel, Joy, and Olive all lived to adulthood. And we'll talk a little bit more about Olive and Vachel later on in the program. But Vachel was a graduate of Springfield High School here in town, and then set off to Hiram College to study medicine. He found that was not the career field for him. He really wanted to pursue a career as an artist, and winds up receiving some training and education at the Chicago Art Institute and the New York School of Art. But he did leave Springfield several times throughout his life, continued to come back here, had many different accomplishments in his art and writing. And this gives you a little idea of the timeline of his life and where he is at. And we'll go through more of his life later on and learn about it. But first, I'm going to give Sheila an opportunity to tell you a little bit specifically about one of his experiences as a child and how that helped shape his career as both a poet and an artist.
Hi, welcome to another room here in the Vachel Lindsay house. I'm sitting in a corner of the room that's designated the library here in the Vachel Lindsay home. It really served as a kind of family room for the family, but I'm sitting in what I think of as the magic corner. This is a corner with view books from the world's Columbian Exposition, postcards of artwork and of various countries. And I don't know, I think that there's something about that kind of age, of that impressionable age of 13 going on 14, early teen years, that make certainly kids with an artistic bent, but I think all of us very susceptible to enchantment. And I really imagine that this trip that Vachel took with his sister Olive and his father, Dr. Lindsay, up to Chicago for the world's Columbian absolutely enchanted him. His mom had gone up first in June of 1893, and I can't overstate how big an event this was. It was the world's Columbian Exposition. Almost all of the states of the United States were represented. There were nearly 50 countries who came and presented exhibitions here. And nowadays, yeah, it's true. There are aspects of that exposition that we now think of as problematic. The glorification of Columbus, the Columbus part of the Columbian Exposition, some of the representations of people from other cultures. But I think if we can just back off and try to see it through the eyes of a 13-year-old boy who was just out of school and going up to Chicago with his family, we can surrender to that sense of magic and enchantment. The 6-month city, I've read statistics that I think something like the number of people who visited Chicago and the World's Columbian Exposition during the 6 months it was on in 1893 is equivalent to something like 1 out of 4 of the population of America at the time. It loomed large in people's memories for anyone who went there. And it was an ideal city, albeit temporary. It was a kind of utopia. It was a city of beauty and light, and literally electric light. And it's interesting that there was a piece of public poetry that was prepared for and read at this Exposition at the opening of it by a woman who was to prove very important in Lindsay's life later on, Harriet Monroe, the publisher and editor of Poetry Magazine, who was a lifelong supporter and promoter of Vachel Lindsay and his poetry. She wrote a poem called The Columbian Ode, which I'm not going to read all of for you here, but it kind of gives you a little bit of the feel of this utopian uplift. Music unconquerably clear and strong from earth shall rise to haunt the peopled skies when the long march of time, patient through birth and death, through growth and blight, shall lead man up through happy realms of light unto his goal sublime. Okay, I do think that Harriet Monroe was a better publisher and editor than she was a poet, but it gives you kind of the feel of this exposition and the ideals that informed it. And of course, you can go up, you can see remnants of the exposition in Chicago now. The Museum of Science and Industry was the Fine Arts building at the exposition. And there's actually a very cool thing in Jackson Park, on the wooded island in Jackson Park, if you ever get there, the Japanese Garden. It was a pavilion erected by the government of Japan, and I just think of as I don't know whether Vachel Lindsay and his sister and his dad visited that, but it's typical of the kinds of things that they might have seen on their trip there. Now, there's another kind of cool thing that I think must have had an impact on the Lindsay household, and that occurred toward the end of this 6-month period that the fair was on, like from May to October of 1893. And that was the big exposition was the big World's Fair, but there were all kinds of other little breakout expositions or congresses or parliaments, they were called, for special groups. And in September of 1893, the exposition served as host to something called the World's Parliament of Religions, which was not just ecumenical, but a real interfaith, not just Christian denominations, but worldwide, Hinduism, Buddhism, a real effort to create an interfaith dialogue. Now, I find it really interesting that Mrs. Lindsay, who was very involved in ecumenical activities here in Springfield and in her own church work, went with Olive, Vachel's sister, back up again for a second time to the exposition in September. Now, whether she attended the World's Parliament of Religions, that's something someone else may know or something for me to research, but it was definitely something which people were aware and I think had to have an impact on this household. I would like to ask, we're gonna fast forward though to a time when this boy, when Vachel Lindsay, the 13-year-old boy who went to the World's Columbian Exposition, is now a man in his 30s. And if Jennifer could possibly show, I don't know if it's possible to share screen and show images from this poem, The Wedding of the Rose and the Lotus. But if that's not going to work out, that's okay. That's fine. There we go. Thank you. And The Wedding of the Rose and the Lotus. This is also a nice opportunity to see the way in which Vachel Lindsay, as a visual artist, melded his work as an artist with words. And The Wedding of the Rose and the Lotus was, I guess, what you'd call an occasional poem. It was written for an occasion. It was first written actually in 1912 when the Panama Canal was nearing completion. So when literally East and West that had come together at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, when literally the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans were to be connected with one another and No one any longer had to go all the way around Cape Horn. And to celebrate this magnificent technological accomplishment, and also to, I think, for San Francisco to demonstrate to the world how it had recovered from the terrible earthquake that hit it. In 1915, San Francisco served as host city for the Panama Pacific Exposition. And that's another thing you can just only see one building from now. If you've ever been to San Francisco and seen the Palace of Fine Arts, that's also a building that features in a lot of movies. But the Panama Pacific Exposition, not quite on such a grand scale as the world's Columbian, but in the same vein, this was a great celebration, and a celebration of this coming together of East and West. And so this poem you see here, The Wedding of the Rose and the Lotus, was, as Lindsay said, written on the occasion of the near completion of the canal. And it was distributed in pamphlet form to members of Congress. This was a public poem. I mean, in the same way, think about Amanda Gordon speaking at President Biden's inauguration. I mean, we do still have public occasions in which poets write poems specifically for the occasion. They present them. This Wedding of the Rose and the Lotus was distributed to Congress, and I've read varying things, but it may have been read aloud by Lindsay to President Woodrow Wilson and his cabinet. Now, the Wedding of the Rose and the Lotus, we're talking about interfaith and the bringing together of different cultures. That is his conceit in this. That is his idea. That's the trope in this poem, The Wedding of the Rose and the Lotus. Now, again, it's a piece of its time. There is visions of the East and the West that to us may seem rather somewhat stereotypical or naive. The West is the bustling, progressive, always restless, always active principle in culture, whereas the East is like the contemplative, silent, thousands of years of meditation and the contemplative life. But in using this occasion of the opening of the Panama Canal, Lindsay put forth this ecumenical, interfaith, intercultural vision, this utopian, idealistic vision that I think could very well have sprung from his initial experiences at the World's Columbian Exposition and the experiences brought home to his household here in Springfield. I won't read again the whole poem about the wedding of the rose and the lotus, but the lotus, of course, he uses as a symbol of Asian, of Eastern cultures. And it says the lotus is nirvana, the rose is Mary's heart, the rose, a traditional emblem of Christianity, the thorns, the rose, Mother Mary. He says, the lotus speaks of slumber, the rose is as a dart. The lotus is nirvana, the rose is Mary's heart. The rose is deathless, restless, the splendor of our pain, the flush and fire of labor that builds, not all in vain. The genius of the lotus shall heal earth's too much fret. The rose in blinding glory shall waken Asia yet. Hail to their loves, ye peoples. The wedding, they're wooing one another. So hail to their loves, ye peoples. Behold, a whirlwind blows. Not a whirlwind, but a whirlwind blows that aids the ivory lotus to wed the red, red rose. So it's kind of a piece like that Columbian ode that Harriet Monroe composed for as a piece of public art for the World's Columbian Exposition. And if Jennifer could just pull up the second image that we have in connection, this is still a piece of public art. This representation of the rose and the lotus. If you're familiar, in the 1990s, it's still there. It's the mural. It's on the side of the building where I believe the Springfield Art Association Collective is. Anyway, it says you're going down 5th Street, you're past Jefferson, and you're not yet at Washington, and the Alamo is there on your right. And there is this mural. And then Jennifer has this very nice reproduction. And we do have a nice print here that shows you if you come to visit the Vachel Lindsay house. I'm not going to show it to you here because I want you to come to the house, but also because it's under the artwork that we have here is under glass, and I don't think it'll reproduce really well, but you can see it pretty nicely there on the screen. So there you have it, my personal take on the impact that the World's Columbian Exposition had on the Lindsay family and may have had on young Vachel when the entire world came here to Illinois and was brought back to Springfield.
All right. Well, thank you, Sheila, for sharing that story about Vachel's life and that part of his life. And so I'm going to talk just briefly about how we go from the 13-year-old young man visiting the Columbian Exposition to this poet whose work is being given to the President of the United States and members of Congress. Because Vachel did have a journey in between there. Like a lot of artists, when he begins writing and drawing, he struggles to find an outlet for that art. And that's where Harriet Monroe eventually does come into play again in his life. But as a young man, his father was a medical doctor, and it was expected that Vachel would follow in his footsteps and continue in that same career path. So he does head to college with the intention of wanting to be a doctor, but he finds that is really not the right field for him. He really has a desire and the talent to really become an artist instead and a poet. And early in his career, though, he struggles to find a place where he could be published, where people are listening to or reading his work. And so he starts off deciding he's going to take his ideas directly to the people. He decides that he will walk across the United States, handing out printed copies of his work, performing his work to the everyday common person. Vachel Lindsay very much believed in the idea of sort of grassroots activism and the idea that you could enhance your own community, and if every person would work together to improve their own community, then together we could work towards improving the greater world. He wrote a document which he called the Gospel of Beauty, which he would share with people as he walked. And the last part of it, he talks about the idea that he says the things most worthwhile are one's own hearth and neighborhood. We should make our own home and neighborhood the most democratic, the most beautiful, and the holiest in the world. The children now growing up should become devout gardeners or architects or park architects or teachers. And he goes on and he says they should find their talent and nurse it industriously. And then it says they should travel the world to find out, you know, all the ideas they can about democracy and about beauty. And then they should return to their hometown and use what they have learned to improve the lives of people around them. He says in their darkest hours, they should be made strong by the vision of a completely beautiful neighborhood and the passion for a completely democratic art. And he also, when he's doing these travels, he doesn't take a lot of money with him. He believes strongly that he should do work or exchange entertainment, reading, performing his poetry in exchange for room and board during his travels, which he often does. He takes 3 major journeys, and I'll show you. I'll just show them quickly here on the PowerPoint. But he winds up in 1906 walking from Florida to Kentucky, in 1908 from New York to Ohio, and in 1912 from his home here in Springfield all the way to New Mexico. And he's also, as he is performing for people, as he's traveling, he's exchanging stories with people as well, getting to know the people who are around him. And a lot of these people are people who are living in very rural areas, people that are working as farmers or laborers. And he's learning their stories and trying to understand their background, where they come from. And a lot of the things he observes and witnesses become parts of other poems that he writes later in his career as well. At the end of that final journey, he is very exhausted. His health starts to take a toll on him after walking that far. Winds up visiting some relatives in California at that time. And it's around that time that he hears about the death of General William Booth, who was the founder of the Salvation Army. Vachel also wrote a poem honoring him and describing what he feels General William Booth would have received upon arriving in heaven. And it was a call and response poem, and it became one of his most popular, most well-known poems. He would perform that for audiences across the United States later in his career, and achieve a lot of fame with that poem. Eventually, he does get a piece published, and Harriet Monroe was a big supporter of his early on. She would publish his work in her poetry magazines and journals throughout his life. And I'm going to tell you, though, a little bit about one poem, another poem specifically that he wrote. Just a couple of years later, Vachel's family was well-read and well-traveled. They were very involved with their church. Vachel's older sister Olive married a medical doctor named Paul Wakefield, and the two became medical missionaries in China and served abroad for a large part of their careers. At the same time, Vachel's mother organizes groups in Springfield. She forms what's called the Women's Missionary Social Union here in Springfield, and they talk about bringing women from different churches across Springfield together, much like Sheila talked about a little bit about that happening on a much larger scale at the Columbian Exposition. Before that time period, even Mrs. Lindsay had helped organize women from religious groups in Springfield to work together to do mission work and other work to improve the community. She helped to form women's educational groups and things like that. She becomes very interested in figuring out not only how she can support her own daughter and son-in-law who are serving in China, but how she can support the people living in China as well. They witness humanitarian issues that are taking place in China at that time, and she and her husband, Dr. Lindsay, decide that they're going to go and visit their family in China, and at the same time, they are going to observe and learn as much as they can about China, about Chinese culture, and bring all of that information home, very similar to kind of what Vachel's written about in his Gospel of Beauty, and see if they can figure out what is the best way that the people of Springfield and the people that they know can help to provide support for people in China who need it. So in May of 1914, Dr. and Mrs. Lindsay get on a ship headed to China. And if you're familiar with that time period in history, you have an idea of what's about to happen over the next few months. The Lindsays arrive in China in late July of 1914. And immediately, of course, they subscribe to newswire services and newspapers to try to keep track of what's happening in the world, because the world starts to fall apart in late 1914. And here they are halfway around the world visiting another country at that time. Vachel is here in Springfield, and he receives postcards like the one you see here from his father in China, that's telling him that his father is very closely following the war, and it brings it very close to Vachel's own heart. One of these postcards like this says, among other things, that today Japan has issued an ultimatum to Germany, which if not answered satisfactorily, will cause Japan to take a hand in the war. It is not known yet what the ultimatum is, but it is probable that Germany must agree not to bring the war into this part of the world. Both Japan and Germany had holdings in China at that time. And so you can imagine if you were sitting here in the United States and there is world crisis unfolding in other parts of the world, and your family happens to be very close to where that's happening, the amount of worry and what you're going to feel thinking about your family and what they might be experiencing. Vachel takes that very close to heart, and of course he also is keeping up with the news, and he would have seen just a few days after it might have even before that he received this postcard, that Japan would declare war on Germany and on Austria-Hungary. And that means that his family, although not at the beginning of the war, not directly in the midst of things, that there's a possibility that they could be. And the reason that I chose the area of the house that I'm sitting in right now is because behind me here is this beautiful fireplace with a mirror over it. This house was built long before the Lindsays lived here. It was built in the 1840s. And one of the early guests who spent time in this home was Abraham Lincoln. As the world is unfolding, as the crisis is unfolding in the United States in Lincoln's life in 1860, as he's preparing to leave Springfield to assume the presidency, he would have visited this house. It belonged to his sister and his brother-in-law. May very well have looked in the mirror by the fireplace that's right behind me. And Vachel then is seeing his own reflection in the same area of the house several years later, as he realizes his own family is in the midst of what could be a very real and difficult crisis for them. Vachel has to think about what his reaction is going to be, not just only to his own family's involvement in what's happening, but also what's happening in general worldwide. And a lot of artists and poets are thinking about that as they're hearing news of the war as well. Vachel, reflecting on the history of his own hometown in Sangamon County and that previous resident of Springfield who had also dealt with a war, Vachel sits down and starts to write. And the poem that he writes becomes known as Abraham Lincoln Walks at Midnight in Springfield, Illinois. And the beginning of that poem is, it sounds it sounds like Lincoln, but it also sounds like something else. He starts out, he says, "It is portentous and a thing of state that here at midnight in our little town, a morning figure walks and will not rest past the old courthouse, pacing up and down." And while you eventually hear about Lincoln and his shawl and his famous top hat, you also kind of wonder, is Lincoln the only figure that Vachel is imagining walking like stoically through the streets of Springfield, wondering what to do in the face of war? Or is this also how Vachel is kind of picturing himself and his own reaction to his family's involvement in that crisis? But the poem goes on to become very well known. And again, it is one of the poems that gets recited many times, not only during Vachel's life, but often afterwards. We've actually got a letter here from Carl Sandburg that was written after Lindsay's death, stating that Sandburg himself recited that poem at another event after Lindsay's death. So that poem became one of Lindsay's best known, another one of Lindsay's best known poems throughout his life as well. Vachel published many books of poetry and lots of poems. And so, of course, we obviously don't have time to cover all of them tonight. But we do want to talk a little bit about things that would happen after that time. Throughout the 1920s, Vachel achieves, or throughout the 19-teens and up through 1920, Vachel starts to achieve national acknowledgement for his work. And so much so that he, in 1920, in the fall of 1920, he and his mother go to England so that he can perform there. Vachel Lindsay was the first American poet ever invited to perform at Oxford University, and he also performed at Cambridge. Abraham Lincoln Walks at Midnight was one of those poems that he performed. And then he also performed some of his other poems there as well. One of them was a poem that was very close to his mother's heart. It was a poem he had written earlier called The Proud Farmer. The poem was actually inspired by his grandfather, his mother's father, and it talks about being the Midwestern farmer. These stories of the West and the frontier life were what really became very popular for Vachel amongst his performances in England. And this is the last stanza from The Proud Farmer. And many a sturdy grandchild hears his name in reverence spoken till he feels akin to all the lion-eyed who build the world, and the lion dreams begin to burn within. You'll also see there a copy of the play Mary Rose, which was written by J.M. Barrie. That was one of the plays that Vachel and his mother attended while they were in London. And that actual copy of the book that's photographed and put there is one that Vachel bought for his sister Joy and her husband and sent to them as a Christmas gift. And in the inscription, he says that this is the last play. This is the last play I ever saw with Mama. And we saw them in London in October of 1920. He says the play is evidently Barrie's meditation on the loss of so many who were close to him in the Great War, without too much mentioning of the war itself. If you're not familiar with the play, it's about a young girl who disappears and then comes back later, and she has not aged at all, and it's as if she's in the same state that she was when she had left, even though quite a bit of time has passed. Later on, when she becomes a young woman and a mother, she disappears again, and this time is gone for many years. And when she returns, she appears as she was when she disappeared, and she is now younger than her son, who has aged to an adult. So, but it really is kind of Barrie's reflection on the loss of people who were close to him during that time. So it's interesting that was the play that they chose to see, being that they themselves had experienced some loss in their own lives with the loss of their own the three younger children in the 1880s, and Vachel's father had passed away just 2 years before they went to England as well. So those things kind of all would have influenced his career. He goes on to continue performing throughout the 1920s, marries a woman named Elizabeth Connor. They have 2 children together, and he winds up at the end of his life returning to Springfield here. Vachel had struggled amongst people of Springfield to find acceptance and to have people really appreciate some of his work. But at the end of his life, he is invited to perform here in 1931 at the church, the same church that his family attended, and it would wind up becoming the last performance of his life. And so the last stanza of the last poem he performed is here. We shall see silver ships, we shall see singing ships, valleys of spray today, mountains of foam. We have been long away, far from our wonderland. Here come the ships of love, taking us home. He would perform that poem here in Springfield. That would be his last performance. That was in November of 1920. And unfortunately, just a few weeks later, Vachel would take his own life here in Springfield. But his legacy continues on even today. In addition to his written poetry, he was very famous for the way he performed it. And his performance style is very similar to what we would call performance art today. He kind of invented that style of performing. He was really one of the first people to do it. That work itself has influenced many other forms of art and performance that are done today. Vachel was also a pioneering film critic. He wrote what is probably the first book on how to evaluate film and view film as a form of art. So he has quite a few things to his name. We're grateful that we were able to share with you a few things about his life today. And so what we're going to do is we're going to finish up our part of the program here, and then get a chance for you to ask us any questions that you have. We certainly do want to invite you to come and see us. This house is open every day of the week for tours. You can make a reservation for a tour on our website, which is here, or send us an email about other types of programs and things that you're interested in. This house is in Springfield on 5th Street. We are just south of the Governor's Mansion here in Springfield. And we'll leave you with one of Lindsay's most famous quotes, which comes from one of his early poems called On the Building of Springfield. It says, "We must have many Lincoln-hearted men. A city is not builded in a day." And so we encourage you to share stories about yourself and about other Sangamon County residents, and we're very happy to be able to have shared this with you tonight. So we'll turn it back over to Ann to see if we have questions or comments that we can reply to.
Sorry, my mic was muted. Thank you for sharing some stories about Vachel. I know he is an individual that we connect with at least one or two of his poems. But in preparing for tonight's discussion, I was drawn quite a bit to the Springfield Golden book because as a person who has lived in Springfield their whole life, a lot of times you end up driving past the house that's on Fifth Street, and then you get a chance to see maybe some performances done that talk about Vachel, but you don't really get to dive in as much. So what as we wait for questions to come in, my question to both of you is, what has drawn you to study Vachel Lindsay? I know that there's a lot of different historic sites throughout Springfield, but you two ladies are very knowledgeable about this one particular poet. So what drew you to him?
Well, I'll tell you a story about when I started here in 2013. Actually, my first day here, when I walked in, I noticed this house looks exactly like the house where I had my very first apartment on my own was an older Victorian style home. That had been divided into apartments. And so the style of the woodwork here and the layout of the house is almost exactly like that. And so it just felt like a very familiar place to me when I came in. While Jenny Battles was managing the site at the time, showed me around and was telling me a little bit about Vachel Lindsay, we went upstairs to one of the rooms, and on the wall were drawings done by a different local artist who had just illustrated one of Vachel's poems that he wrote for his niece Martha called The Little Turtle. And it was very exciting for me because I immediately remembered when I was in nursery school, when I was 4 years old, and our teacher taught us how to recite that poem about the little turtle snapping at the minnow and the flea and all those kinds of things. But when you're 4 years old, nobody tells you, the person who wrote this was a man named Vachel Lindsay. You just know that it's a fun poem and there are hand motions that you get to do along with it. And so that kind of immediately drew me in as a connection to the house itself and the story. Since that time, gotten to do a lot more reading and research, and been very fortunate to talk with some very talented and very knowledgeable staff members and volunteers here who have really helped further inspire me to even want to research and learn even more.
Wonderful. All right, Sheila, what drew you to Vachel Lindsay?
Yeah, I think for me, it's his unifying of many arts, the visual, the written. In addition to my archives and history background, I've got a theater, dance, performing arts background. So the rhythm, the motion, the music, the performance aspect. I highly recommend his book, The Art of the Motion Picture. It really holds up very well as a way of thinking about visual rhetoric, about how the movies work, written at a time when there really wasn't that level of serious consideration being given to movies as an art form.
So as you've studied and you've been able to pinpoint what drew you in, you start to look at the poetry. Is there something that we can really learn from Vachel in the midst of studying him? Because I know that Sheila, in the beginning, you spoke quite a bit about how the World's Fair affected himself and his family, and how he was able to relate with others. So the combination of his life, what's a lesson we can learn from him in particular?
Well, I think that just getting back to what you were saying, Anne, I think there still is the phrase, but it was more popular several decades ago. Think globally, act locally, and that was the bumper sticker, the poster, the everything So I think that one thing to take again is the idea that this for Lindsay, Springfield and his house in particular was a lifelong base. But he went out into the world. The world came here. There was this constant dialogue between the world and the local scene, and that certainly is part of the gospel, as it were, that he wished to spread, and it was to think globally, take it back to your own community, and act locally.
That's wonderful. I think that, if we had more people focusing locally, a lot of the bigger issues can kind of be worked through. If we had people who are more focused on their surroundings and caring for others, which it showed throughout his career in making people think, but also just the way that he presented. One of the pictures that I was looking for in the midst of researching him was that iconic image of him going like his hands in the air. Have you had performers come in and try to recite his poetry and do the movements that he had?
Well, I'll hand that to Jennifer, I think, because she's more experienced with the house than I have.
We've had some over the years. The Vachel Lindsay Association has worked with a couple of, or at least one reenactor who has actually performed as Vachel Lindsay in the first person at different events. So we've done some things like that. I know we've also done a lot of programs with children. One of the things Vachel did was he wrote poems specifically for children and would visit schools and other places where there were groups of children, and they would do what were called poem games, where Vachel would read the poetry and either teach movement to the children that went along with it, or encourage the children to find their own rhythm and dance along to the poem in their own way. And we've done quite a few programs like that, and it's been really great to see. I also got to do a program a few years ago here. We welcomed some Montessori students here for a tour, and they were doing a unit on poetry as part of their education, and they got to perform their own poetry here in the house, which is really, I think, speaking very much to the legacy of Vachel Lindsay. And this house was frequently used for that during the time the family lived here as well. That was a favorite pastime of the family, either between themselves or even when they would have guests over, to share poems and stories and entertain one another, even right here in these two rooms where Sheila and I are doing the program tonight. So it's great not only to, we've not only had opportunities for people to try to read Vachel's work in a way that he would have read it, but also then for other poets to be able to share their own work in the way that they would like to share it with us.
That'd be really cool to find some of the key artists just venturing in and later on developing a love for Lindsay's work and how he performs, and then coming back and sharing that. So a lot of the comments that I've been getting through our comment page is mostly we have Catherine Harris on here, who's familiar with the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library's collection of books and materials, and they stated that they have a lot of copies of the Golden Book within their collection. But one of the things that really drew me to her comments was this one in particular. His reaction to the Congo racist thought was phenomenal. So the fact that he was able to relate that in his poetry, to give you kind of an idea of what some of our individuals are looking at in regards to his poetry and his work. And Jennifer, you mentioned in the introduction the travels of the family and their experiences. Not many people knew that his mother, Catherine, was a community visionary, and that kind of rubbed off on her son. But you didn't go too much into what her husband did. Can you explain to our guests what his occupation was?
Sure. So Dr. Vachel Thomas Lindsay was, of course, a medical doctor. His career was not quite as along the same conventional path that most people would have to do today, because course requirements in that time for doctors were much different. His family struggled financially. He actually attended 1 year of medical school that he was able to pay for, and then he did not have, and this was in the 1870s, and he didn't have a whole lot of money left to pay for the rest of the schooling. But he talked to his advisors and mentors who suggested that he already had quite a bit more education than some of the other doctors who were actively practicing in that time. So they suggested, why don't you open a practice and earn some money, and then you can return to your studies once you've have the money to pay for that. And he did do that. Then he wanted to do some more traveling, but he actually wound up opening a practice just south of Springfield here, in what I guess that would now be within Springfield today, but it was south and outside of town. You would actually have to go across Lake Springfield today to get to that area, but in his time there was no Lake Springfield. But he would work as a doctor in that area at the beginning of his career, and then he is always looking for additional ways to enhance his education and to learn more. He was very interested in obstetrics, and he heard that there was some cutting edge research in Europe about obstetrics, in particular preventing infection and making sure that mothers and babies stayed healthy during the labor and delivery process. So he wanted to go to, particular to Vienna, to the hospitals there to study that, and he wanted to do that was in 1875. At the same time, his sister Eudora and her best friend Kate Frazee were teachers, and they were hoping to travel to Europe at the same time. Their aim was a little bit different. They were interested in art and language and culture. They wanted to study that, particularly in Italy, but across Europe as well. But their parents, because they were two young ladies who were not married, their parents were a little nervous about them traveling to Europe alone. So Dr. Lindsay says that he will accompany them on the trip because he is planning to head that direction anyway. While they're on this ship, of course, Dr. Lindsay gets to know Kate a lot better. At the beginning of the trip, neither one of them thought that they wanted to get married. Dr. Lindsay had already been married once, and his wife tragically had become very ill and passed away. He was still mourning, from that. Kate herself was very focused on her career, wanting to do some other things, and hadn't really thought too much about marriage. But they meet each other on this journey to Europe, and on July 4th, 1875, they get engaged to be married. But they part ways for a while so that they can pursue each their own individual goals there. Dr. Lindsay does go to Vienna and studies, and one of the things that he starts to study are these methods of preventing infection, which include things like hand washing and other very common sense applications to prevent infection or transmission of disease that we have today. And it was really very early in the process for that kind of thing. A lot of doctors and scientists were just starting to study those types of things. And Dr. Lindsay brings that information back with him to the United States and uses it throughout his career in his medical practice. He is one of the first doctors to really believe and subscribe to the germ theory of disease. Dr. Lindsay also believes very strongly that everyone deserves medical care, offering to serve all the citizens of Springfield. When some doctors would not serve people who were not white or people that could not afford to pay the full price for their medical care, Dr. Lindsay is willing to serve everybody and at the rate they can afford to pay, even if that rate is nothing. So he really reaches out to the community of Springfield to provide medical care for them throughout his career. And even though he moved from the south end of town to this house and to the downtown area and then to this house as he gets married, because he feels like his wife really wants to be involved in the community and have a lot of chances that there's more opportunity for them to do that if they're living in town. He continues to still serve that area south of town. He'd go out even in the middle of the night on his horse and buggy to help deliver babies wherever he was needed. So he really had kind of a pioneering career in the medical field as well.
Wonderful. So my last question that I'm going to ask you ladies, because I know that we're coming to a close here. So one of the very interesting things that we can't provide on video, but we can only experience by going to the house itself. As you give tours of the home, which you give probably every single day, and if my memory serves, probably like every half hour you have a tour going through during the busy times. What is your favorite artifact that you like to showcase to visitors, and really you think is just really cool to have in the house? Because I know sometimes in meeting some visitors that come through, it's just really cool to I hate to say play house in it, but to be in a home that's just transports you back to a different time. And I'm sure there's some artifacts that you both find pretty interesting. So what are those?
I think for me, it's not so much one particular artifact or handful of artifacts, but there are just particular spots that feel as though they have really good, powerful, magical energy. And I'm sitting in one of them now. This little tableau with world's Columbian view books and postcards and so on. And it's really a neat little corner of the room if you do come visit. Visit the house. Some very nice reproductions of Lindsay's works that really meld the words and the visuals. So this whole space right in here is, I think, my favorite part of the house here in the library.
All right, Jennifer?
I would say some of my favorite things are some of the very small details. The Lindsay family in general loved to write, and they keep records of things. And they kept lots of souvenirs from their travels, and journals and diaries and things. And you can get to read a lot of this stuff, even in their own handwriting. Some of it we've actually put in our archive at the old state capitol. Some of it is in the collections of the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library as well, just because of their easier, better ways to preserve the condition of those original pieces. But getting to see so much of things just about their daily life written in their own handwriting is really interesting to me. I can go upstairs and I can see exactly what they saw when they went to London in 1875, because their travel guide from London from 1875 is still here. And they've underlined everything they saw, wrote down what day they saw it, whether it was open or closed when they got there, and all of those types of things. We have the ship manifest from every cruise they went on, so you can see what cabin they were assigned to. Although if I had to pick one artifact in the house, I would say my favorite is the trunk that is upstairs in Joy's bedroom. That trunk belongs to their son-in-law, Paul Wakefield, who was a medical missionary in China for nearly 20 years. And that trunk traveled with them everywhere they went. The label on the trunk to get it back and forth to where it has to go simply says Dr. Wakefield, Springfield, Illinois. That's the only address on it. And yet everywhere that Dr. Wakefield went, that trunk and Dr. Wakefield always made it back here to this house at 603 South 5th. It's really remarkable, and it's always great fun to imagine what they would have put in that trunk during those different journeys, and all the places that it would have went, and the ships that it would have been on, and all the memories that must have created for their family when they're traveling.
That is wonderful. Well, I want to thank the two of you for coming on and speaking about Vachel Lindsay and his life, his poetry, showcasing some of his art that he created, and introducing us to one of these families here that made a huge difference in the community as well, and the impact they had on their children to go out and express it through their talents. So thank you so much for coming and being a part of the Sangamon Experience's programming. And I encourage all of you who are tuning in to go and see the Vachel Lindsay home. If you have not, if you have in the past, I encourage you to go back again. because there are always stories unfolding to better understand the life and times of Sangamon County citizens and one of the families that really made an impact on the community. So thank you again, ladies. All right, folks, this is concluding our program here. We want to thank you for tuning in, and if you have missed any of our other programming, I encourage you to check out our YouTube page. It has all of our videos from past programs, from our Sangamon road trip that we took over the summer, to community trailblazers for the African American community, as well as for Women's History Month. This particular program will also be on YouTube if you didn't catch all of it. But I also encourage you to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. We are constantly presenting stories on different citizens who lived here within the Sangamon County region. We are also highlighting our current citizens. If you have a story from living here in Sangamon County, I encourage you to send it to us at Sangamon Experience at uis.edu. If there is a particular memory that highlights your experience here within the Sangamon County area, we want to record it and preserve it for future generations. Whether it be the big snow that we've had back in the early 2000s, some of the tornado scares that we've had in the past, or if you have a COVID story that you'd like to share with us, we would like to keep track of those and make sure that they are kept and preserved for the next generations to learn about the lives of Sangamon County citizens. Also, stay tuned with our Hometown Pride exhibit, which is a digital exhibit on our webpage. We have a new addition to it that's coming out in May called The Great Outdoors. We will be highlighting the different landscapes of Sangamon County, how the citizens have preserved them, how we've interacted with our parks, but also how Sangamon County as a county has been shaped and changed over the years, why that is, and also the creation of the Great Lakes Springfield. So thank you again for joining us. Tune in next time when we have Dick Hart coming and discussing the diverse citizenship of Sangamon County. So thank you again for joining us, and tune in next time for more Sangamon Experience programming.